In October 1981, with harvest dust drifting low over Cloud County and settling in pale bands along the highway ditch, Bo Coleman eased a 1969 Chevrolet C20 into the co-op scale line outside Concordia. The truck had 312,000 miles on the odometer, rust bubbling along both rear fenders, and a tailgate held level by a chain he had cut and repinned himself. He stepped out in patched denim overalls, a faded seed cap, and boots with 2 fresh stitches across the left toe. Men in cleaner jackets looked once and then looked away because in that line appearance worked like shorthand. Bo looked like a tenant hanging on by one season. Wade Harlan looked like the future. Wade stood near the office door in a pressed Western shirt with dealership embroidery, polished belt buckle, and keys to a new 3/4-ton pickup carrying dealer plates. He shook hands, laughed loudly, and told younger operators that modern margins required modern iron and modern financing, then pointed toward credit packages at 10.9% variable interest as if he were pointing toward salvation. The contrast was vivid enough to feel theatrical, but the arithmetic behind it was plain. Bo farmed rented ground between Concordia and Hutchinson with hand-welded toolbars, rebuilt gearboxes, and tires, pulled from salvage rows at auctions, where most buyers came for coffee and gossip more than purchases. He drove each evening to a plain 2-bedroom house in Reno County, bought in 1976 for $28,500 cash, paid in one transfer, never refinanced, never remodeled, beyond replacing a leaking water heater with a used unit he found for $95 and repaired with a $14 element kit. In public, he looked outmatched. In private, his ledger showed annual household costs kept under $11,400, crop sales spread across 12 months to avoid panic pricing, and a reserve account that rose every year by deliberate increments. $4,800 in 1977, $9,200 in 1978, $14,100 in 1979, $19,700 in 1980. Bo did not arrive at that discipline by temperament alone. He was 13 when he watched his father lose rented acres near Turon after 2 thin wheat years collided with rising note payments on a tractor and baler that had seemed affordable at signing. The principal was $22,000. The rate stepped from 6.75% to 9.25% in less than 3 years. Monthly payments rose by $46 at first, then by another $39. And those small figures became large under low yields. Bo remembered the numbers because his father wrote them on the back of feed invoices and set them under a salt shaker at supper. By the spring of 1959, they were 34 days behind. By July, they were 72 days behind. The equipment left on a flatbed. His father did not speak much for a month afterward, then said one sentence Bo repeated for decades. Debt does not care how hard you work today. He started with repair work because repair work was what he could enter without borrowed capital. At 16, he was earning $1.40 an hour in a machine shed outside Arlington, cleaning carburetors, cutting torch stock, and pressing bearings out of housings that older men had given up on. By 21, he had saved $3,870 in a passbook account and $640 in cash sealed in coffee tins at home. A banker in Hutchinson offered him an operating line of $15,000, called it the right way to begin, and slid paperwork across a desk with a smile that was not unkind. Bo thanked him, declined, and took seasonal welding contracts instead, billing $7 an hour, then $9.50, then $12. In 1969, he leased his first 120 acres at $38 per acre, with one rule written by hand into the agreement: rent due after harvest in one payment, no prepayment penalty, no variable clause. Yield that year averaged 31 bushels of wheat per acre, sold in portions from July through March at prices between $1.21 and $1.38. Gross income reached $4,850. Net after rent, fuel, seed, and repairs was $1,640. He kept $1,200 and rolled $440 into parts inventory, because inventory meant fewer emergencies, and emergencies were where debt entered. From 1970 to 1976, he built his operating model one unremarkable decision at a time. He rented additional acres only when cash reserves could cover one full bad year of rent and input costs. He set a personal cap of $950 per month for household and farm overhead withdrawals combined, and in 5 of those 7 years, he stayed below $800. He bought used steel and angle iron in mixed lots at farm sales, averaging 11 cents per pound, then fabricated brackets and hitches that dealers quoted at 10 times his materials cost. He learned to rewind electric motors from a retired co-op technician in exchange for splitting firewood. He collected service manuals the way other men collected baseball cards, and by 30 he could split a transmission case, diagnose hydraulic drift, and reassemble driveline components to factory tolerances without outside labor. When neighbors replaced a planter for $32,000 financed over 5 years, Bo rebuilt his worn units with $640 in chains, bearings, and opener discs, plus 2 weekends in the shop. The rebuilt rig planted straight. It planted on time. It did not send him a bill every month. By the second week of November 1981, the coffee counter argument had turned into local folklore. Wade would tap a sales brochure and say a man either scaled with finance or got left behind. Bo would stir his coffee, nod once, and say very little. In a county that valued visible momentum, silence read as weakness. Yet his records from that same season showed a different momentum entirely. Crop revenue of $86,430 across wheat, milo, and soybeans. Total production and operating costs of $58,210. Household expenses of $10,980. Net retained cash of $17,240. He split that retained cash into 3 buckets, with strict percentages he never varied without reason: 50% reserve, 30% land fund, 20% parts and contingency. That meant $8,620 into reserve, $5,172 into land fund, $3,448 into parts and contingency. Precision protected him from mood. His daily habits looked plain enough to be misread as deprivation. He packed lunch in a washed peanut butter jar and old bread bag. He wore work shirts until cuffs frayed through, then cut those shirts into shop rags. He tracked fuel burn by field and implement, writing gallons and acres in a pocket notebook at the end of each pass, then comparing actual consumption to expected draws so he could catch injector issues early. He drained, filtered, and reused hydraulic fluid when test strips showed acceptable contamination levels, saving roughly $430 a year without gambling on equipment life. He kept one checking account for bills, one money market for reserve, and one certificate ladder timed to likely input purchases, so a seed invoice did not trigger a penalty withdrawal. None of it looked dramatic, all of it compounded. Before Springfield work in 1982, he had reached a position few people around him guessed. Rent commitments were covered in cash. Input purchases for the first planning window were prepaid, at winter discount rates, reducing total seed and chemical outlay by $2,180 against in-season pricing. Household cash for 12 months set separate from farm money. No equipment note hung over the operation. No variable rate clause waited in fine print. Bo still drove the rusted Chevrolet. He still lived in the same two-bedroom house with the same uneven porch step. Wade still pointed at him as a warning, but Bo had built a system that could take a hard hit and keep moving, and the ledger already proved it. On the third Monday of March 1982 at 6:40 in the morning, Bo heard the sound he feared most, not loud but final, a hard metallic pop under load as the transmission housing on his primary field tractor opened along an old stress line. He shut it down within seconds and climbed off into cold mud with a flashlight and a rag. The crack ran nearly 9 inches, from the lower bolt pattern toward the differential seam. Welding it in place would not hold through planting torque. A replacement case from salvage yards in Kansas and Nebraska, if he could even locate one quickly, would cost between $2,700 and $3,400 before freight and machining. He had 23 days before his first planning window tightened. By 10:15 that same morning, he parked the rusted 1969 Chevrolet C20 at Wade Harlan's dealership lot outside Hutchinson, squeezed between 2 polished pickups with chrome wheels and dealer tags. Bo stepped out wearing the same patched overalls and faded cap, grease still on his cuffs, and crossed bright concrete that had been pressure washed before opening. Wade met him near a row of new tractors, clean boots, pressed shirt, bright smile calibrated for witnesses. 2 younger operators stood nearby with brochures folded in their back pockets. Wade spoke loudly enough for all 3 to hear. He said Bo had reached the point where doing it the hard way was costing real money, then laid out a package with practiced precision, $18,000 down, $2,146 per month, 84 months, variable at 10.9% with annual reset. The arithmetic was the argument. At the quoted terms, Bo would pay $180,264 in monthly payments plus the $18,000 down. Total $198,264 on equipment carrying a list price of $162,500. If the variable rate reset to 13.2% after 2 years, the projected total rose above $214,000. Wade framed that spread as the price of reliability and scale. Bo read each line without expression, asked one question about prepayment penalties, and tapped the clause with his index finger when Wade answered. 3% of remaining principal. If early grain sales were strong, and he tried to clear the note quickly, he would still pay for leaving debt. Bo folded the packet once, set it back on the counter, and said 6 words. "I will not buy my risk." He drove north from the lot with the heater fan rattling and the ledger open on the seat beside him, held down by a socket set. This was where his discipline had always come from. Not fear of work, fear of fixed obligations that survived bad weather and low prices. In 1973, he had watched a neighbor named Carl Dempsey finance a new tractor and planter package for $64,000 at 8.25%, a decision that looked sensible when wheat sat above $3.50 per bushel. 2 wheat crop years and 1 hailstorm later, Carl carried $51,900 in remaining principal, plus $14,600 in operating debt rolled over at 11.4%. He sold livestock first, then machinery, then 160 acres that had been in his family for decades. Good man, relentless worker, wrong structure. Bo had documented those collapses because memory alone can soften hard lessons. His notebook from winter 1978 held a page titled Payment Math Under Stress. It listed 5 cases from Reno and Cloud counties, each reduced to cash in and cash out. Case 1 showed a note payment equal to 31% of gross crop income in a normal year, then 49% in a poor year. Case 2 showed fuel, fertilizer, and interest climbing together while yield fell 18%. Case 3 showed a variable rate shifting from 9.1 to 12.6%, adding $427 each month to an already tight budget. Bo circled one line in red pencil. Volatility plus leverage equals forced sales. He did not say that sentence to other farmers. He built his life around it. At noon, he stopped at a payphone outside a feed store and called an auction clerk near Hutchinson because bankruptcy listings were posted there before most people heard details through coffee shop talks. The clerk told him about an estate and lender liquidation scheduled for Thursday, machinery only, preview at 7. Bo wrote 3 numbers on a receipt from his shirt pocket. Lot 47, Lot 63, Lot 81. Lot 47 was a 1974 John Deere 4430 with uncertain hours and hydraulic drift. Lot 63 was a broken disc he wanted for steel. Lot 81 was pallets of mixed bearings and seals. He set a hard spending ceiling before he arrived. $14,500 total, cash only, no exceptions. Bo had seen enough pride and thrift plans unravel at exactly this step, where one urgent purchase exposed every weak assumption in the system. He closed the receipt book, fixed his spending ceiling in ink, and prepared to let Thursday's bidding settle the question. Thursday came with wind out of the northwest and dust rolling over the sale yard. Bo arrived before sunrise in the same Chevrolet, carrying a thermos, a flashlight, and a cashier's envelope from his Hutchinson account. Men glanced at his truck and moved on toward shinier prospects. The 4430 sat near the fence with faded paint, torn seat vinyl, and one rear tire weather-checked along the sidewall. Most bidders dismissed it after a brief walk-around because the hydraulics lagged and the steering felt loose. Bo spent 31 minutes with it, checking blow-by at startup, listening at idle for rod knock, testing 3-point lift under a borrowed weight, pulling the hydraulic filter canister, and looking for glitter in the drain fluid. He found none. Wear, yes. Catastrophe? No. Bidding on Lot 47, opened at $9,000, climbed in $500 steps, stalled at $12,000, then nudged to $12,400. Bo raised one hand once. Hammer fell. He paid immediately, then bought Lot 63 for $210 and Lot 81 for $340, finishing at $12,950 before loading chains. On paper, he had solved his spring crisis for less than the down payment Wade had quoted 3 days earlier. In practice, he still needed the tractor field ready. He spent $1,180 on hydraulic parts, $220 on filters and fluids, $96 on hoses, and $340 on a salvaged tire replacement. 48 hours in his shop followed, spread over 4 nights: disassembly, cleaning, valve reseating, pump seal replacement, steering linkage shim, pressure test. Total outlay reached $14,786. Equivalent finance package minimum outlay in month 1 would have been $20,146. By the first week of April, Bo had the 4430 working 12-hour days on pre-plant tillage and fertilizer passes. Fuel burn averaged 6.8 gallons per hour, slightly above his retired unit, but within planned tolerance. He tracked downtime at 2.3% over the first 180 operating hours. lower than county custom benchmarks he had copied from extension bulletins. His spring ledger for 1982 showed the difference with stark clarity. Machinery payment obligations, 0. Repair and parts, $2,486, including non-tractor items. Fuel, $8,920 through June. Seed and chemical, prepaid in winter, already locked. Cash reserve after spring operations remained above $24,000. He had absorbed a major failure and kept planting on schedule. Wade did not let the purchase pass quietly. At the coffee counter in Concordia, he joked that Bo had bought himself a museum piece with hydraulic manners. The line traveled quickly, because public certainty always travels faster than the private arithmetic. Bo listened once, then returned to his routine. He greased fittings every evening. He cut and rewelded a worn drawbar eye instead of ordering new. He rebuilt a monitor harness on his planter for $38 in connectors and wire, avoiding a $690 replacement kit. He fabricated a grain cart extension from salvage sheet and angle stock for $390 in materials where dealer inventory listed comparable capacity upgrades near $17,500. None of these choices made for dramatic storytelling in town. They did, however, lower his break-even cost per acre season after season. 3 days passed before he ran the final test that mattered. A full-load pull through heavy ground west of Arlington, where weak hydraulics revealed themselves fast. The 4430 held pressure, temperature stayed in range, and steering response remained tight after 4 continuous hours. Bo drove home after dark, parked beside the house he had bought for $28,500 cash, and entered one line in the ledger before supper. Major risk event contained without debt. Under it, he wrote the April totals. Gross receipts, year-to-date, $19,430 from staggered grain sales. Total outflow, year-to-date, $14,120. Net change, plus $5,310 during the very month a forced borrower would have moved sharply negative. What looked like stubbornness from the outside was a framework with measurable edges. Bo used cash because cash narrowed uncertainty. He repaired because repair converted skill into margin. He avoided variable notes because variable notes transferred weather and market risk into legal obligation. By July 1982, wheat harvest confirmed the practical result. The 4430 did not fail by wheat harvest as predicted. It ran daily support work, hauled, loaded, and turned through heat without complaint. Bo sold wheat in tranches between $3.18 and $3.44 per bushel instead of taking one pressured price, netting an additional 17 cents average compared with same-day elevator bids during peak delivery week. That summer also clarified something larger than one tractor. In counties where status often attached to the newest paint and largest payment book, Bo looked unchanged, still in worn denim, still driving the truck most people had mentally written off. Yet his operating model now had proof under stress conditions. Major mechanical breakdown in planting season, resolved with $14,786 cash and labor, instead of a 7-year payment stream that could have exceeded $200,000 under rate movement. One decision, one machine, the only equipment purchase of his career. Everything else would be built, rebuilt, scavenged, or fabricated around it, and the gap between appearance and reality would keep widening whether anyone applauded or not. The widening happened quietly in 1983, because quiet was the only way Bo Coleman trusted growth. He did not add acres because pride told him to. He added them when the ledger said 1 bad year, would not break him. Spring wheat averaged 36 bushels per acre on his best rented ground and 29 on lighter fields near Hutchinson, with sales staggered from July through February at prices between $3.22 and $3.61. Gross farm revenue closed at $112,870. Total operating costs, including fuel, rent, repairs, and hired harvest help, came to $79,440. Household spending was $11,260. Net retained cash was $22,170, and he moved it by rule. $11,085 reserve, $6,651 land fund, $4,434 parts and contingency. By the first week of January of 1984, he had turned his buckets into a system with timestamps and maturity dates. Reserve money sat in a money market account yielding 8.1% annualized. Land fund money was laddered into short certificates at 9.4%, 10.0%, and 10.3%, so he could access cash without paying penalties during rent negotiations. Parts and contingency stayed liquid in checking because broken machinery never waited for bank calendars. He recorded each account on one ruled page, then added 3 columns he had not needed earlier: weather shock estimate, price shock estimate, and overlap stress. Overlap stress was his private measure of what happened when weather and price declined together. In plain arithmetic, he was learning to insure himself. A financed operator with $2,146 monthly machinery payments carried $25,752 in annual fixed equipment obligation before fuel or seed. Bo carried 0. If grain prices dropped 20%, the financed operator needed either higher yield, additional debt, or asset sales to bridge the gap. Bo needed reduced discretionary spending and tighter repair cycles. He could bend without entering default language. That difference looked small in optimistic years and enormous in thin ones. Before we go any further, if you want to see how this discipline ends at the county auction in 2019, hit subscribe now, because the numbers between 1984 and that day are the whole lesson. Through the mid-1980s, his records read like a metronome. 1984, gross $118,640, cost $86,900, household $11,320, retained $20,420, reserve. Year-end $43,505. 1985, gross $103,210 during lower wheat prices, cost $80,770, household $10,940, retained $11,500, reserve $49,205 with interest credits. 1986, gross $126,930, cost $91,380, household $11,180, retained $24,370, reserve $61,760. 1987, gross $134,500, cost $95,840, household $10,890, retained $27,770, reserve $75,930. In each year, he repaired instead of replaced where he could measure reliability, not because he was nostalgic, because depreciation and interest were expensive ways to buy status. He also began buying distress-priced inputs when cash gave him leverage. In February 1986, he bought an entire lot of unopened bearings, belts, and hydraulic couplers from a closing repair shop for $3,900. Retail equivalent was $11,870 across invoices he later matched. In 1987, he acquired 2 damaged grain augers for $600 total, combined salvage sections into one working unit, and avoided a $7,400 replacement quote. In 1988, he spent $1,140 on steel and sprockets to rebuild a worn feed conveyor the dealers priced at $9,800 new. Every line item was modest. The cumulative effect was not. By late summer 1988, drought stripped optimism from both counties. Dryland yields fell hard. Some fields produced less than half of projection. Bo's yields dropped too, but his break-even remained lower because fixed obligations stayed low. His 1988 gross fell to $89,740. Costs fell less, to $74,220, because certain inputs were already committed. Household expenses were $10,760. Retained cash was only $4,760, his smallest surplus in 7 years, yet still a surplus. He marked the line in pencil and underlined it once. Surplus in drought year meant the structure held. The next decade brought steadier weather and stronger management habits. By the second week of March 1990, Bo expanded rented acreage to 1,420 acres across 6 leases, each negotiated with clear terms and no variable rent clauses tied to elevator spot peaks. He paid between $41 and $58 per acre, depending on soil class and water access. He began using simple forward contracts on part of expected production, never more than 35%, to protect baseline cash flow without overcommitting in uncertain years. In 1991, he posted gross revenue of $156,880, costs of $111,640, household spending of $12,080, and retained cash of $33,160. In 1992, retained cash was $29,940. In 1993, $31,220. In 1994, $38,410. The land fund changed from ambition to capacity in those years. Year-end land fund balance reached $184,600 by 1995 and $229,300 by 1997, even after replacing bins roofs and upgrading drainage tile on leased fields he expected to hold long-term. By 1998, following a season of disciplined sales between $2.58 and $3.04, wheat and $2.17 to $2.42 Milo, the land fund closed at $271,900. His reserve account stood at $312,400. Combined liquid assets crossed $584,300 without a single long-term equipment note. The 4430 still ran. Now with a rebuilt hydraulic pump and a steering valve body, he machined himself after finding a cracked casting. The contrast with his peers was not a morality tale. It was timing, structure, and risk concentration. Eli Brewer, a good operator with strong agronomy instincts, expanded fast when yields and prices looked stable in the early 2000s. He financed a $186,000 combine and 2 tractors under cross-collateralized loans that linked machinery notes to his 640-acre position. Initial blended interest near 9.5% looked manageable. Then resets rose above 14% across renewal windows after rate movement and tighter underwriting. Annual debt service moved from roughly $47,000 toward $69,000, while 2 weak production years cut gross receipts. He sold cattle first, then equipment, then acreage under forced terms. He did not lose ground because he was careless. He lost it because leverage removed his margin for bad timing. Nora and Dean Pritchard carried a similar burden in dairy, where daily cash flow can hide structural strain until it is late. They borrowed for parlor upgrades and herd expansion, taking a package near $420,000 with variable components and a feed storage add-on. When feed and fuel climbed together and milk checks softened, debt service plus operating costs exceeded monthly intake for 14 straight months. They refinanced once to stretch amortization, adding fees and extending interest exposure. The new payment looked smaller at signing and larger in total cost. By settlement, they surrendered the dairy and moved to town. They remained respected because neighbors understood they had worked without pause. The numbers outran their effort. Luis Mendez faced a different path to the same wall. He ran a family quarter section with discipline and supplemented income through custom work, but several seasons of narrow margins pushed his operating line into carryover. The bank rolled short-term credit into term debt at 12.7% and required tighter reporting schedules that consumed time he could not spare. When one equipment failure hit during harvest and repair bills stacked on top of interest, he sold the quarter to satisfy obligations and preserve his household. He did the responsible thing with hard options. Responsibility does not always prevent loss when debt absorbs flexibility. By the first week of October 2001, Wade Harlan's lot looked like an emblem of confidence, full of new paint and easier signatures. He had become the region's loud advocate for financed upgrades, and many farmers listened because the argument contained truth in favorable markets. Newer equipment reduced downtime. Scale could improve per-acre efficiency. Tax treatment on depreciation helped some operations. The non-trivial trade-off was fragility when volatility arrived. Bo recognized that fragility and refused to underwrite it with his own balance sheet. He kept compounding. 1999. Purchased 320 acres at $790 per acre, total $252,800 cash, plus $8,940 closing and filing costs. No lien recorded. 2000. Gross $171,300, cost $118,200 including property tax on new acreage, retained $40,980. 2002. Added 2 grain bins from auction salvage for $6,400 and rebuilt foundations for $2,300, compared with $74,000 for equivalent new storage capacity. 2004. Reserve plus marketable certificates reached $702,000. 2006. Retained cash, $62,440 on strong yields and disciplined sales. 2008. Purchased 480 acres at $1,950 per acre. Total $936,000 cash. Closing $21,600, no debt. Then the broader crisis cycle tightened again. Credit standards hardened after banking stress. Then input costs spiked, and weather brought uneven relief. Fertilizer prices jumped, diesel stayed elevated, and operating lines renewed on stricter terms. In 2011, several growers around Reno and Cloud counties carried variable operating debt above 8%, while commodity prices began losing momentum. By 2012, drought arrived and stripped away remaining cushion for debt-heavy operators. Appraised values remained high on paper, but cash flow determined survival, and cash flow was thin. Bo's 2012 ledger was severe but stable. Gross revenue declined to $238,400 from prior projections, near $301,000. Total costs were $179,500, including irrigation fuel on selected leases, emergency feed purchases for a small cattle side operation, and elevated parts usage from longer run hours in heat. Household spending remained $16,880. Net retained cash still landed at $42,020 because there were no machinery notes, no land mortgage payments, and no forced principal reduction schedule. He could choose timing. Choice was the asset everyone else was trying to buy at the worst moment. Eli Brewer could not secure renewal on workable terms and faced liquidation language on remaining collateral. Nora and Dean were already out of dairy and living on settlement discipline, helping family where they could. Luis Mendez had preserved dignity by exiting earlier, yet his sons were now trying to re-enter on leased ground in the same hostile credit environment. Bo drove the same rusted Chevrolet to fields and auctions, same faded cap, same patched cuffs, and from the road he still looked like the smallest operator in the county. Inside the books, his framework had become infrastructure. Liquid reserves and near-cash instruments sat above $2,100,000 by late 2012. Land owned free and clear across 2 counties. Fixed obligations tightly bounded, and one principle repeating through every page. When the cycle turns, debt chooses for you. Cash lets you choose. The county was about to learn what he would do with that choice. Within 2 weeks of closing the 2012 harvest books, Bo Coleman opened a new page in the same ledger where he tracked fuel draw and bearing wear, and he labeled it Notes Out, Zero Interest. He did not announce it at church, did not discuss it at the coffee counter, and did not ask anyone to call it charity. He drove to a small office in Hutchinson on a cold Thursday morning with a manila envelope and 3 draft contracts, each 1 page, each one plain. Principal amount, no interest, repayment only after profitable years, and 1 required covenant that mattered more than collateral. When repaid, the borrower had to extend help to 1 more family on similar terms. The first note was for Mara Brewer, Eli Brewer's daughter, who had the agronomy skill to farm, but not the liquidity to survive a drought year renewal cycle. She needed seed, rent float, and enough working cash to avoid signing a variable operating line at rates above 8% with annual reset language. Bo wrote $75,000. Payment schedule. None in loss years, voluntary principal in profitable years, annual accounting review each December. Security. Second position lien on equipment only if she sold without notice. She signed with a steady hand and then cried once in the hallway where nobody could see her. The second note was for Cal Pritchard, Nora and Dean's nephew, trying to keep a small, irrigated alfalfa and hay plan together after 2 motors failed, and replacement quotes came back near $58,000 installed. Bo's note was $42,000, earmarked for 2 used irrigation motors at $14,600 each, rewiring supplies, and emergency well service. Terms were identical except for 1 additional line requiring pump maintenance logs, because Bo trusted people but verified systems. Cal said almost nothing beyond thank you, and I will keep records. That was enough for Bo. The third note was the largest. $110,000 to the Mendez brothers, Luis Mendez's sons, for a lease-to-own package on acreage near Hutchinson, where the owner wanted certainty more than top bid. They needed down payment support, first-year input coverage, and repair float for older equipment they could afford to own. Bo's contract gave them runway instead of pressure. No interest, no monthly extraction during establishment years. Annual review, pay when profitable, help one more family when stable. The money did not come from a windfall. It came from 30 years of retained margin and restrained withdrawals. At the bank in Hutchinson, the operations officer asked him twice to confirm the transfer amounts because his work clothes did not match the balances on the screen. He authorized $227,000 out the same day and left enough liquidity to absorb another drought year without borrowing. By the end of that afternoon, 3 farm households had working capital without compounding interest attached to every weather report. Wade Harlan heard by Monday and dismissed it at the Concordia counter as sentimental bookkeeping. He said no interest notes taught bad habits, said modern agriculture required professional capital structures, and said kindness did not pencil out when machinery failed in July. He then offered a young operator a packaged line that blended equipment financing and operating credit at rates that looked fine on the first page and expensive on the 6th. Wade was not a cartoon villain in a clean hat. He believed his model. He had sold it for years. He simply underestimated what patient cash could do when credit tightened. By the spring of 2013, Mara had planted 420 acres under cash flow discipline that looked very familiar to Bo's own early years. She prepaid part of her seed order at winter terms, cut custom spraying by learning calibration herself, and reduced per-acre machinery cost by sharing field passes with Eli's remaining equipment. Her first-year gross was $286,400, with operating costs of $241,900, leaving $44,500 before household draw and tax. She repaid $8,000 principal that December, not because the note demanded it, because she could. Cal restored his irrigation schedule and moved from survival hay yields to reliable contract tonnage, posting $31,200 net after all costs in 2013 and repaying $5,000. The Mendez brothers posted a thin but positive year, repaid nothing, and remained current by the only standard in their contract: truthful books and viable operations. That contrast, payment pressure versus survivable structure, stopped being a private philosophy and became a local test case. People across Reno County watched 3 fragile operations enter a volatile season without compounding interest clocks and then finish the year still intact, with books clean enough to plan from instead of excuses to hide behind. From 2014 through 2018, the quiet multiplier started to show. Mara expanded to 610 acres through disciplined leasing, repaid the remaining $67,000 over 6 years, and by 2018 had no high-interest operating debt. Cal paid off his $42,000 in stage principal, added custom haying routes, and built a reserve account that reached $63,400. The Mendez brothers weathered 2 uneven seasons, then caught strong yields and repaid $110,000 in full by late 2018 while securing long-term control on 980 acres through a lease-to-own path that conventional lenders had rejected in 2012. None of them became flashy. All of them became durable. 3 days before the 2019 county auction near Hutchinson, lenders circulated updated approval thresholds that reduced available leverage mid-process for several bidding groups. That mattered because 1,120 acres tied to distressed notes were set to sell in parcels and then as a block, and many expected financed buyers to dominate the day. Wade arrived early with a polished pickup, a buyer list, and a confidence built on decades of closing deals in rooms like that one. Bo arrived later in the same 1969 Chevrolet C20, rust still on the fenders, grease still on his cuffs from a morning repair. Bidding opened strong on the first parcels, then slowed as financing contingencies collided with revised terms. 2 approvals stalled outright. One group asked for recess to contact a regional bank. Another reduced bids by nearly 9% after recalculating debt service at higher rates. The auctioneer called for firm bids on the full block. Silence held for several seconds that felt longer than they were. Bo raised his card and named a number. Another bidder answered. Wade's network hesitated, recalculated, and stopped. Bo bid again at $3,864,000. Hammer fell. Because recent sales had collapsed on paper promises, the clerk required verified funds before final acceptance. Bo handed over a cashier's check drawn from accounts accumulated over 37 years. The number matched to the dollar. Verified. No financing contingency. No appraisal clause. No interest rate rider waiting to undo the sale at closing. In that moment, for everyone who had read his patched overalls as evidence of fragility, his true financial position became undeniable. Reaction in the room was restrained, but visible. One lender representative removed his glasses and looked again at the check. A younger operator, who had laughed at Bo's truck years earlier, stood quietly with his bid card folded in both hands. Wade did not speak for several minutes. The arithmetic had spoken first. Bo then did what made the purchase more than a headline. Before leaving the grounds, he announced long-term lease options below prevailing local rates for 3 young operators, including Mara Brewer and Cal Pritchard, with renewal terms designed around productive stability rather than extraction. Mara secured 360 acres at $142 per acre, when comparable ground was leasing near $175. Cal secured 220 acres at $138 per acre, with irrigation maintenance cost sharing tied to documented repairs. The remaining acreage tranche went to the Mendez brothers at a stepped rate beginning at $135 and rising only after 2 profitable years. Each lease required soil stewardship benchmarks and 1 community clause. Each operator had to mentor at least 1 beginning farmer over 5 years. By week's end, the lease structure had become part of the county's broader conversation about risk, not as a slogan, but as a documented operating model. Under stress, the operators with room to breathe had kept fields productive, crews employed, and repayment credibility intact, while highly levered bids had stalled before closing. The deeper examination sits in Bo's books, and the books are blunt. From 2013 to 2019, his annual household spending ranged from $16,880 to $18,940, never crossing $19,000 despite growing assets. Average retained farm cash flow, after operating costs and taxes, was approximately $312,000 per year. Land taxes and maintenance rose with acreage, yet debt service remained zero on long-term equipment and land notes. The one purchased tractor, the 1974 John Deere 4430, continued in light and support roles after periodic rebuilds, costing far less than replacement cycles would have required. Here is the year-by-year ledger sequence that county accountants later cited when people claimed his model could not scale. 2013 retained cash, $228,700. Notes issued, $227,000. Year-end liquid reserves, $2,214,000. 2014 retained cash, $244,300. Principal repaid by borrowers, $18,000. Year-end liquid reserves, $2,402,000. 2015 retained cash, $271,900. Principal repaid, $29,500. Year-end liquid reserves, $2,615,000. 2016 retained cash, $295,600. Principal repaid, $40,000. Year-end liquid reserves, $2,866,000. 2017 retained cash, $318,400. Principal repaid, $56,000. Year-end liquid reserves, $3,140,000. 2018 retained cash, $347,800. Principal repaid, $70,500. Year-end liquid reserves, $3,458,000. 2019 pre-auction liquid position after operating allocations, $4,325,000. Auction check, $3,864,000. Post-purchase liquidity remained positive and functional for operations. The multiplier effect was equally measurable. Bo's initial $227,000 in zero-interest notes preserved or rebuilt operating capacity across 3 families, controlling more than 2,000 acres by 2019. Their combined annual gross farm receipts crossed $2,900,000 in normal weather years. They employed seasonal labor, contracted local repairs, bought local inputs, and stabilized land use that might otherwise have gone idle or been stripped by short-horizon leasing. One disciplined balance sheet had become regional infrastructure. Wade's Concordia branch closed within 18 months of the 2019 sale, a business outcome shaped by many factors beyond one day, including tighter credit, margin compression, and changing buyer behavior. At a later Farm Bureau gathering near retirement, he acknowledged what he had resisted in public for years. He had been wrong about what resilience looked like. He had sold efficiency. Bo had built endurance. And in farming, endurance is what keeps a county alive. People repeated Wade's sentence for a week, not because it was dramatic, but because it was precise. And precision had finally entered a conversation that had run on appearances for almost 40 years. In the days after that Farm Bureau meeting, Mara Brewer sat at her kitchen table with a yellow pad, a pencil worn to a short nub, and 3 rent sheets spread side by side. The lease rates Bo had set after the auction lowered her projected fixed land cost by $11,880 against prevailing terms on comparable ground. She circled the number, then built the plan outward from it. Fertilizer locked early, diesel prepaid on a volume contract, and a weather reserve line she had never once been able to carry through spring. At harvest, she closed her books at $712,300 gross across wheat, sorghum, and soybeans, with total operating costs of $544,900 and net operating income of $167,400 before household draw. A week later, she mailed Bo a principal transfer anyway, even though her original note had already been repaid in full, with a memo line that read, "Keep it moving." By the second week of February, 2021, Cal Pritchard was at his shop desk rewriting the way he sold risk. His custom hay routes had always run on relationships, but relationships did not set minimum tonnage when a dry spell cut yield. He shifted the routes into written seasonal contracts with floor clauses. On paper, it looked bureaucratic. In field conditions, it was a pressure release valve. That season, his irrigated alfalfa and hay operation on 420 acres produced 1,980 contracted tons at an average delivered price of $186, and his custom work added $143,000 in gross service revenue. Full-year gross reached $511,600. Costs, labor, fuel, twine, repairs, irrigation power, closed at $389,700. Net before tax was $121,900. He took $35,000 of that margin and funded a used baler rebuild program for two younger operators who could not obtain commercial financing without signing 9% to 11% variable paper. He used Bo's format without modification. No interest, annual books review, repayment only in profitable years, and a requirement to pass help forward. Late in 2021, the Mendez brothers stood at the edge of a training lot with 6 folding chairs, 1 grease board, and a bilingual handout Luis had edited line by line for plain language. By then, they controlled 980 acres under a blended structure of lease-to-own and long-term lease, with weighted average land cost materially below peak local rates because Bo had prioritized continuity over extraction. They allocated $48,000 to launch an apprenticeship track that combined machinery maintenance, irrigation scheduling, grain marketing basics, and debt risk analysis for first-generation farm workers moving toward operator roles. 6 apprentices entered. 4 completed the full year. 2 started micro-operations on leased parcels under supervision. In 2022, the brothers' books showed $1,084,000 gross receipts, $846,000 in total costs, and $238,000 operating margin, enough to expand the apprenticeship track without grants. At the co-op counter that winter, one landlord asked another why the younger operators were not raising rents to match the spike. Cal answered before Bo did. "You can squeeze 1 year hard," he said, "or you can keep neighbors solvent and still have contractors to call when weather turns." Bo only nodded once. No one in that circle treated it as charity. They treated it as duration math. By spring 2022, the first pass-forward note from Mara went out exactly as promised. $20,000 at 0 interest to a starter household, leasing 160 acres that had been idle after a probate dispute. The family used it to repair a fence, buy seed, and cover first-season fuel without touching high-rate operating credit. In December, they repaid $6,000 in principal and remained current on every vendor account. Cal's 2 maintenance notes also stayed current under covenant terms. One borrower paid $4,500 after a profitable hay year. The other paid nothing in a thin season, but submitted complete records, which counted as compliance. In 2023, the Mendez apprenticeship track produced its first full independent lease operator, and that graduate hired 2 seasonal workers from the same cohort. The multiplier had moved from principal to payroll. Eli Brewer's trajectory carried a quieter dignity. In 2020, he took part-time work in Mara's shop at $22 an hour, mostly hydraulic diagnostics and preseason inspections. On a cold morning in early 2024, Mara handed him a revised wage sheet with $28 an hour penciled in at the top and no speech attached. He repaid old personal obligations in small monthly transfers, not dramatic ones. By 2026, his savings had rebuilt to $38,400, and younger renters had started calling him before they made repair versus replacement decisions. He did not conceal his history. He translated it into warnings they could use. Nora and Dean Pritchard remained in town near their grandchildren. After debt settlement, they bought a paid-off two-bedroom home for $96,000 cash equivalent from remaining assets and careful budgeting. Dean took a part-time feed supplement delivery route 3 mornings a week, mostly to stay active. Nora kept household books with the same discipline she once applied to milk checks. In 2025, her ledger pages showed no consumer debt, no medical balances, and reserve enough for ordinary shocks. The loss of the old operation was still real. The daily structure was stable. Luis Mendez retired to Hutchinson with dignity intact and no unresolved claims against his name. On Saturdays, he stood at the apprenticeship yard, hat low, reading safety instructions and lease clauses aloud in Spanish and English. He liked to stop at the numbers and make trainees repeat payment terms until they could explain them back. Numbers shrink when you read them slowly, he told one new renter who had signed nothing yet and looked relieved. By 2026, he had watched both sons run profitable seasons without rolling operating credit into term debt, the exact trap that had taken his quarter section years earlier. Wade Harlan's outcome was neither collapsed theater nor triumphant conversion. The Concordia branch closure held. In 2021, he completed retirement paperwork, sold remaining dealership equity, and shifted into regional consulting focused on inventory risk and used equipment appraisal, a narrower business, lower volume, steadier demand. For the first year, he advised lenders mostly on residual values. Then his own market feedback loop narrowed his recommendations. Durable operators were buying serviceable, used units with transparent repair histories and minimal payment chains. At a lender panel in 2023, he said he had spent decades selling efficiency and too little time modeling fragility under rate resets. He was not ruined, he was revised. In farming communities, that counted as a form of public correction. By the first week of March 2024, the County Extension Office held a risk management workshop in a fluorescent-lit room with 40 metal chairs and coffee gone bitter by noon. With Bo's permission, staff had copied portions of his anonymized ledger framework into the packet. Fixed obligation thresholds, reserve targets, prepayment timing, and repair versus replace break-even grids. The original notebook stayed in Bo's house, stacked by year in a plain cabinet near the kitchen table. The method, however, had entered public circulation. The other form of legacy sat in his yard and started on command. In 2026, the 1974 John Deere 443 O carried a documented 19,870 hours, a third seat cushion, a second major hydraulic rebuild, and paint faded nearly to matte. Bo used it for light tillage and auger duty, never show duty, because sentiment did not justify poor deployment. The 1969 Chevrolet C20 still started on cold mornings, after 2 pumps of the pedal and a patient turn of the key. The odometer had rolled and been tracked manually twice. Estimated true mileage stood near 487,000. Rust held both rear fenders. The tailgate chain was still the one he had pinned years earlier, replaced once only at the hook. His 2026 household spending closed at $18,740, with property tax, utilities, groceries, insurance, and fuel fully itemized. No luxury lines, no debt service. Operation-wide, he controlled 2,940 owned acres and 1,100 leased acres across Cloud and Reno counties. Conservative year-end valuation, using local comparable sales and discounted equipment estimates, placed net worth near $18,700,000. He did not announce the number. The assessor, lenders, and counterparties already had it on their own paper. By that same season, every named life remained in present tense rather than in rumor. Bo still lived in the two-bedroom house he had bought for $28,500 cash, porch steps still uneven, no remodel beyond practical repairs. Mara farmed 610 acres, debt-light, profitable, while mentoring two beginning families through her own zero-interest notes. Cal ran custom hay and irrigated alfalfa on 420 acres with audited reserves and seasonal contracts that protected cash flow. The Mendez brothers operated 980 acres and had trained 21 apprentices. By the end of 2026, 12 still in agriculture, as employees, managers, or lease operators. Eli worked in Mara's shop, solvent and respected. Nora and Dean stayed steady in town, close to family. Louise stayed retired, useful, and at peace. Wade stayed on public record that he had misread resilience. At a small winter meeting in Reno County, someone asked Bo for one rule that explained the whole arc. He gave them 50 words and stopped. Debt makes weather louder. Debt makes price drops final. Cash does not make you smart, it makes you patient. Repair gives you options. Options let you help people. If your balance sheet cannot absorb a bad year, it is not growth, it is exposure. At dusk that evening, Bo shut down the 4430 beside the shop. He had stocked one bearing and one seal at a time, wiped his hands on an old shirt sleeve cut into rags years ago, and walked past the rusted Chevrolet toward the same two-bedroom house, where the ledgers were waiting for the next line. The screen door clicked shut behind him, and the kitchen light laid a warm square over the ledger table, where every year sat in labeled stacks, from 1969 through 2026, twine-tied and dusted clean. Bo set the newest book down, uncapped his pen, and entered 3 lines before he washed for supper. Diesel, 42 gallons. Shop labor, 3.5 hours. Rental inquiry, pending review. Then he opened the narrow cabinet by the table and pulled a flat envelope marked March 1982. Inside were the auction tags for Lot 47, Lot 63, and Lot 81, the feed store receipt with those same numbers in pencil, and the bank copy of the $12,950 withdrawal. He placed them beside the current ledger and left them there for morning, because the Extension Office had requested originals for county archiving. At 9 the next morning, 6 trucks lined the gravel by Bo's shop. Mara Brewer arrived first with 2 binders and a coffee thermos. Cal Pritchard backed in with a trailer of worn baler parts for inspection. The Mendez brothers came together carrying a bilingual training report clipped with soil test sheets. Eli Brewer walked over from Mara's service truck with a crate of rebuilt hydraulic couplers. By noon, they had spread records across 2 workbenches and 1 old door laid over sawhorses. No speeches, just books. Mara showed 2,026 gross receipts of $934,200, costs of $706,400, net operating income of $227,800, and a reserve ratio of 0.41 against projected annual expenses. Cal showed $548,700 gross, $417,900 costs, $130,800 net with 0 high-interest obligations. The Mendez brothers showed $1,196,000 gross, $932,000 cost, $264,000 net, and apprenticeship retention at 71% across 3 cohorts. After lunch, Mara opened a second folder with 3 zero-interest notes she had issued under Bo's covenant. The first, $20,000 was to Aaron and Lila Finch, the starter household on 160 leased acres. They had repaid $6,000 in 2022, $7,000 in 2024, and the final $7,000 in October 2026, all verified by transfer slips and input invoices. The second, $18,000, went to a beginning tenant for irrigation pipe and pump repairs. Balance outstanding was $9,500 after 2 profitable seasons. The third, $12,000, funded seed and fuel for a dryland startup. No payment in drought year, then $4,000 principal after a better harvest, exactly as contract language required. Cal's 2 maintenance notes had both converted to paid-in-full status by August 2026, and he had opened a third at $15,000 with identical pass-forward terms. The Mendez Apprenticeship Program had graduated 21 participants, 12 still active in agriculture, and 4 now mentoring newer entrants. 1 note had become 9 notes. 1 family stabilized, had become multiple payrolls. 3 days later, at the Cloud and Reno Extension Workshop, the county archivist placed Bo's 1982 envelope under a document camera, while 37 growers watched from metal chairs. She read each amount aloud, then passed down certified scans. Auction purchase, $12,400. Repair parts, $1,180. Support lots, $550. Total, $14,786. Beside it, she projected the old financed quote that Bo had preserved in Wade's brochure packet. Down payment, $18,000. Monthly, $2,146 for 84 months. Variable clause and prepayment penalty included. The room did the subtraction together, line by line. The numbers held. The physical evidence was now archived, indexed, and publicly teachable. The originals went back to Bo in a new acid-free sleeve, and he returned them to the same kitchen cabinet that evening. By the first week of May 2027, the younger operator who had once laughed at Bo's truck, Travis Meeker, parked outside that same shop and stood with his cap in both hands before he spoke. He said he had been the one at the 2019 auction with the folded bid card, and he'd gone home angry at lenders when he should have been angry at his own structure. He brought his books and asked for a repair versus replace review. Bo gave him 40 minutes, 1 yellow pad, and a single threshold rule. Fixed payments could not exceed 22% of conservative gross. Travis sold 1 overfinanced sprayer, refinanced nothing, and moved to used equipment with documented service. By year-end, he was still in business. The loaded look from 2019 had finally paid off in plain words. Wade Harlan's resolution settled in public and in private. At the 2027 lender panel in Salina, he repeated what he had first admitted at retirement, this time with operating examples and no defensiveness. He showed a slide comparing 2 farms with identical acreage and yield history, one carrying variable machinery debt, one carrying none, then highlighted the debt service spread under rate resets from 7.9% to 12.4%. After the session, he drove to Bo's place in a used half-ton with no dealer plates, stepped into the shop and handed back a laminated copy of his own old sales flyer from 1982. "Keep this with the rest," he said. "It belongs with the lesson." Bo took it, nodded once, and set it in the cabinet with the archived envelope. Wade did not become a convert to nostalgia. He became a better analyst, advising banks to test borrower endurance under bad year scenarios before approving aggressive terms. He retired fully in 2028, solvent, quieter, and on record as revised. Roll call in 2028 read like a ledger that had learned to breathe. Bo Coleman, age 79, Still in the two-bedroom house bought for $28,500 cash. Household spending at $18,960 that year. Operation footprint: 2,940 owned acres, 1,100 leased acres, all managed without long-term equipment debt. Estimated net worth, using conservative land comparables and depreciated machinery values, $19,240,000. The 1974 John Deere 4430 still ran for light tillage and auger duty at 20,410 document hours. The 1969 Chevrolet C20 still carried rust on both rear fenders, and an estimated 495,000 miles tracked manually since the odometer rolled. Mara Brewer farmed 610 acres, remained debt-light, and had issued $50,000 total in pass-forward notes, with repayment performance above 80% by principal value. Cal Pritchard held 420 acres, ran custom hay routes, and maintained audited reserves sufficient for one thin year without outside credit. The Mendez brothers controlled 980 acres and expanded their bilingual apprenticeship to 32 cumulative trainees, with 19 active in agriculture. Eli Brewer worked full-time in Mara's shop by choice, trained younger mechanics, and kept personal savings above $40,000. Nora and Dean Pritchard remained in town near grandchildren, mortgage-free and stable. Louis Mendez remained retired in Hutchinson, teaching contract reading on Saturdays. Travis Meeker remained operating after restructuring. Every named life had a present tense address, a current balance, and no vanished footnotes. In late October 2028, with wheat seeded and first frost silvering the low spots, Bo sat again at the kitchen table, the uneven porch step creaking once when the wind shifted. He wrote 6 words at the bottom of the day's page: "Debt is loud. Patience is compounding." Then he closed the ledger and turned out the light. If you want more stories where arithmetic defeats appearances, subscribe now, because this county was not unique, and the pattern repeats wherever discipline outlasts fashion. If this story made you reconsider one financial habit, leave a comment with the exact payment threshold you believe a farm should never exceed in a bad year. Share this with one person who looks ordinary, drives an old truck, and is quietly carrying more wisdom than the room gives them credit for. At dawn the next morning, the 4430 started on the second turn, settled into a steady idle, and pulled into a pale field under a sky that did not care who looked rich.